Like there's this whole thicket of requirements and restrictions on what you can do. You don't get paid until the work is finished. You can't apply unless it's at minimum 1 year before the premiere date. You have to have a signed letter from the organization that's presenting the concert, etc., etc. It's one line after another of restrictions. The piece has to be at least 10 minutes long. It has to be for X number of instruments, and so on and so forth. Can you imagine, Webern having to like any
10 minutes,
any real artist, any real artist who's not a total sude, trying to make sense of this crap. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, the cave paintings guys.
They would have been out of luck. They would have been out of luck. Definitely.
It makes you long for like old school Hollywood producers or aristocrats, because at least you can kind of play to their kind of
tastes. It's a human being. Yeah, Esterhazy's a music nerd. Like Ludwig of Bavaria is a music nerd.
Sure. But let me read you this is the coup de grace, okay? This is the really hilarious thing. So there's, under the eligibility criteria in this form, it says it has to be a musical work, an original musical work, that it consists of a work of the spirit or of the mind, une œuvre de l'esprit. And then it says in brackets, see Article L1112-2 CPI. It's like
a work of the spirit defined.
Solomon and Smith. Samuel Andreyev is a working artist, a composer, and a teacher of composition. He lives, like me, on the German-French border, wrong side of it. As well as being a working artist, he has an excellent YouTube channel where he hosts interviews with other artists, poets, composers. He also does video essays on composition, on music more generally. Highly recommend his channel if you are not familiar with it. Welcome to Solomon and Smith. Gardez-les juteux, grand garçon.
Ensure it remains succulent, large fellow.
Gardez-les juteux, grand garçon. You're about to listen to a conversation between me, Milo, and Samuel Andreyev. What about, you ask? I respond with a joke. How did Vivaldi manage to write 230 violin concertos? He didn't! He wrote one violin concerto 230 times!
Wow, I was not present for a lot of that.
You want to hear the joke again?
I'll hear the joke again.
Yeah. How did Vivaldi manage to write 230 violin concertos? He didn't. He wrote one violin concerto 230 times.
God, it's funny because it's true.
Same joke works about Yasujiro Ozu films, works about Wes Anderson films, works about Mondrian paintings, works about Mark Rothko paintings, works about Thomas Bernhard novels.
Talentless hacks, all of them.
Here's a similar joke. Not really a joke, more of a comment. Was Stravinsky a great composer? No. He was 5 great composers, all of whom were called Stravinsky and lived in Stravinsky's brain.
And later in Beverly Hills, if I'm not mistaken, with Schoenberg, not with him in like one compartment, but 2 very Beverly Hills style men living in Beverly Hills. And that's very, very good for them and for us and the culture.
The Stravinsky joke also kind of works about Picasso or James Joyce. 5 different men. How did he fit it all in there?
It's a big question. How do they fit in there?
So we talked to Sam about these different kinds of artists, which we dub mono artists and poly artists. Mono artists do one thing over and over again until they die. Poly artists do different things every day of the week, every second of the minute. They can never be themselves. They are constantly becoming themselves and they never arrive. We talk about this duality. We also talk about bureaucracy.
Oh, a lot on bureaucracy and forms and the beauty of a sublime form and why a sublime form could indeed lead to the greatest artwork ever known to man. We just haven't yet got the form, but I think all 3 of us agreed that if the form were produced, the inevitable would occur.
When you say forms, I am immediately thinking of Platonic forms first. Even after it's clear that you're talking about bureaucratic forms and that the conversation is about bureaucracy, as soon as you say forms, I'm immediately the appliest apple.
Yeah, well, I think this is the notion of the bureaucrats as well. They've mistaken the phraseology and understood Plato to mean these things you write on. And so they're really creating quite a few to get to, the artiness of art. Perhaps they're right. We're neutral on all subjects here at Solomon and Smith.
What is the artiest artwork? The most artwork? That's a good one. I think of Jackson Pollock. When you say art to me, I think of a Jackson Pollock painting. I think it is
art
the
removed of all else.
Artwork.
Just pure art. It's just, there it is.
Yeah, I think if
doesn't need anything else.
Yeah, a chimpanzee could realize that this is art. It's my feeling.
Yeah, they distinguish it from reality. They'd be like, reality, art area. Whereas other art can trick you. You can look at it and think, that's reality, wrong. And therefore it's less arty because it's more real. Whereas the Pollock, you're never walking into that thinking, ooh, I've walked into a room of strange splotches.
Yeah.
You're looking at art and you can sort of just put it to one side.
In an alternate universe right now, strange splotch people are looking at completely realistic paintings and going, you can't think of that depicting anything. Just a picture of a table. But because the whole world is strange splotches, they don't understand. Man, this is something. This is a novel idea. This is kind of already a novel I've written. Can a chimpanzee distinguish a Bridget Riley painting from a Rubens painting? The answer is yes. Can a chimpanzee distinguish a J. Dilla beat from a Palestrina mass? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Can a chimpanzee, however, distinguish a Bridget Riley painting from other members of the op art movement? Can a chimpanzee distinguish a Palestrina mass from other Renaissance polyphonic works?
Not convinced.
Bach, huh? What's up with that guy?
Yeah.
When does being really careful about your work produce crap? And when does being really careful about your work produce sublime glory?
Are you fuddy-duddy or are you genius? Yeah. But the notion that the genius man can produce the great work in like 30 seconds because of the 80 years of experience comes into play. But it does make me think of prosthetic artists, and it's frequently said in movies with people with big prosthesis on that they work for like 10 to 11 hours, like The Grinch. Let's pick a big example. The Grinch,
big film,
big movie. 10 to 11 hours with Jim Carrey in the car before they start filming. I find it really hard to conceive of doing anything for 11 hours and coming out with like a sort of high quality, predictable outcome every day. It's another 11. That's mind-numbing insanity. And it's just normal. It's not even like you created 12 great works in 12 days. You've done the same thing for 12 days with an annoyed man as your sculpture.
Has Gimli recently been bathing in mud? Is Gimli groomed? Is he clean? Post-Lothlorien Gimli should look clean and groomed. I don't know why I'm doing this voice. whereas
that's another 8 hours.
Minds of Moria Gimli. Whoa.
What is going on? Fear, this could be a version of hell. You're reborn as one of those prosthetic guys, and you just got to clock into work.
Yeah.
12 hours with John Rhys Davis.
Yeah, did Bach compose like this? Or did he compose like this?
Nonchalant. No sweat, governor. Is this the kind of the Mozart Salieri thing? Mozart's like, yeah, whatever, Requiem. Salieri is, I gotta get it right. Scrub it out. Wrong note. That's a C sharp. It's a C sharp. No, it's not a C sharp. Give me 200 hours on this piece.
Yeah. Did Webern only write so little because of biographical circumstance? Are Webern's pieces just short because Webern could only write in short bursts?
Was he lazy?
Lazy Webern.
Well, imagine Webern doing Gimli's makeup. It's never getting done. He's got like one eyebrow. They got to make do with the one Webern eyebrow of Gimli, son of Glowin.
If you like what me and Milo are doing here, please.
A scepter and an orb deposited in the below link space. Any kind of regal jewelry. However Scepters, you can get your hands on it.
Orbs, crowns, diamonds.
These kind of things.
Topaz. If topaz is valuable, down below in the Patreon link.
If large quantities of topaz have been found recently, don't bother. We're okay.
You get 45 minutes to an hour of extra material per episode.
You mean every single episode?
Yeah.
Including this one?
Including this one. You get extended chat. And the word on the street is, it's very good indeed.
All quality of all substances equal in all places.
I often
philosophical statement.
I often genuinely come away from our Patreon chats with intense brain creative juices flowing. You end up thinking things and ruminating on things and saying things and hearing things you didn't think were possible before the chat began. And I'm not saying this as an ironic, comical, over-the-top statement to big up the Patreon. The Patreon chats really do get me thinking. Now, I could have some sort of mental illness whereby our Patreon chats do this to me. But maybe they'll do it to you too, viewer. Maybe they will.
And it only costs a couple of scepters, one orb.
Yeah, a couple of scepters.
What were you doing with it? We were just sitting there wasting away in the old throne room. Come on. Yeah. The age of monarchy's over. They'll get the glory of the universe in some form.
Yeah. I think some sort of indulgences system.
Yeah. Should we start?
Yeah. All our patrons get less time in purgatory.
Yeah, should we heal the sick? That would be a good little benefit if you pay.
Exactly. If you pay over on Patreon, we will heal the sick, and both you and your relatives can spend less time in purgatory. That's a guarantee.
If you're in heaven thinking, I should have been in purgatory, but for less time, they've accidentally sent me upstairs. We'll sort that out. We'll get you back. It feels wrong.
It doesn't. It's not.
Imposter syndrome in heaven, worst place to get it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the Orthodox think heaven and hell is the same place. Don't know how that works. Look at all the fire and mud versus clouds and harps.
Where are the golden gates?
Orthodox people.
They missed the
Bentley
memo.
Hart. Gobbledygook. That's what I say to that. Gobbledygook.
Heaven has the cherubs and the harps, and hell has the worms, the infinite worms. That's
yeah. And Solomon and Smith can get you out of hell with just
a few
orbs, a few down payments in that Patreon link down below. And even if you're not interested in the fate of your eternal soul, you do get extra chat for it. You get extra stuff.
And you enable infinite Solomon and Smith content.
You enable infinite Solomon and Smith.
An orb has no practical purpose or function. You can't do anything with it. So why hold on to it so greedily? Why, my orb. Give it away. Give it away. The soul will be lighter. The spirit we know what to do with it. We'll handle the orb. Don't worry about that.
Also, like and subscribe. If you're not subscribed already, subscribe and the bell little thing. Click the bell. No one clicks that bell, but you should. Ding, lovely noise. Tchaikovsky 1812 overture. There's bells in it. Carol of the Bells, no bells in it, but
Carol of the Bells, bellless.
Bellless.
Yeah, churches have bells in them.
Yeah, glockenspiel means bell play, but bells play. Yeah,
I think that's a pretty convincing argument there. I don't see anyone resisting these points that have been made. How's it going in the German lands?
I bought my first ever bicycle yesterday.
Wow.
And rode it around today. The speeds, you would not believe them.
It can get a convenient basket in which several items can be stored.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh,
Weightless.
I think heaven is a very, very mild sort of downhill slope.
Or a velodrome, depending on your tendencies.
I think it's scary when the slope is too big, but if it's a mild one and you just stop pedaling and it's free movement. That's the thing I can't get over. Like my entire life, movement has been connected with energy expenditure. I feel like a Japanese man on my bicycle. I feel
good.
like a man of the
feeling.
Future.
You finally discovered this technology.
Yeah, I'm a Japanese future man. I often say this very sentence to myself while biking around at the top of my lungs. I love the feeling of going faster than the fastest man on earth. You know, that really excites me.
Goodbye, Usain.
Yeah, Usain just like struggling to keep up, panting, and even then, you know, he can't sustain that. I just find that hilarious and joyous.
No hands.
Yeah.
No feet. How am I going? Hello.
Hi guys.
Thank you ever so much for joining us, Samuel. That's a very nice room you're in. Look at that.
Thank you.
Ooh,
yeah, nice archway.
Literature. Yeah. Ooh.
Yeah. This is my office. I come here every day. It's a cross-border office. The house is in France, and the studio is just over the border in Germany.
So that's very useful.
Yes, in all sorts of ways. Yes.
We start these conversations with a poetic epigraph, and I'm going to hand over to Milo.
So, yes, this will be a poem by Siegfried Sassoon, written in 1921. Forgive me if I read the whole poem, but I think it's worthy of it, on the occasion of a series of concert performances of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, called Concert Interpretation. The audience pricks an intellectual ear, Stravinsky, quite the concert of the year, forgetting now that none so distant date, when they of folk facsimilar in state of mind first heard with hisses, hoots, guffaws, this abstract symphony. They booed because Stravinsky jumped their Wagner palisade with modes that seemed cacophonous and queer, forgetting how now the hullabaloo they made, the audience pricks an intellectual ear. Bassoons begin, sonority envelops our auditory innocence and brings, to me, I must admit, some drift of things, omnific, seminal, and adolescent. Polyphone through dissonance develops a serpent-conscious Eden, crude but pleasant, while vibro-atmospheric copulations with mezzo forte mysteries of noise prelude Stravinsky's statement of the joys that unify the monkeydom of nations. This matter is most indelicate indeed, yet one perceives no symptom of stampede. The stalls remain unruffled, craniums gleam, swept by a storm of pizzicato chords. Elaborate ladies reassure their lords with lifting brows that signify supreme, while orchestrated gallantry of goats impugns the astigmatic program notes. In the grand circle one observes no sign of riot. Peace prevails along the line, and in the gallery, cargoed to capacity, no tremor bodes, eruptions and alarms. They are listening to this not quite new audacity, as though it were by someone dead, like Brahms. But savagery pervades me. I am frantic with corybantic rupturing of laws. Come dance and seize this clamorous chance to function creatively, abandoning compunction in antisocial rhapsodic applause. Lynch the conductor, jugulate the drums, butch the brass, insanguinate the strings, throttle the flutes. Stravinsky's April comes with pitiless pomp and pain of sacred springs. Incendiarize the hall with resinous fires of sacrificial fiddles, scorched and snapping. Meanwhile, the music blazes and expires, and the delighted audience is clapping. So that was on the occasion, around 1921, hearing the Rite of Spring. I quite like the not quite new. The British audiences
didn't
get
know
it.
Sassoon had this in him. I only know his war stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, big time. Just he did change after this fact, maybe declined somewhat, but war just after war, a serious poet. But yeah, an interesting poem for the subject of today, which will largely be about these sort of invented concepts here at Solomon and Smith of the mono artist against the poly artist. And we understand the mono artist to be the artist that finds a form and then works in it more or less singularly for the rest of their career. So we might think of various artists. We can think in cinema of Wes Anderson, a filmmaker who is almost famously attacked as only makes one film. He can only do one thing, but he is your sort of a premier example of the mono artist. And then the poly artist, and we can take from the poem Stravinsky, very well known for The Rite of Spring and for Petrushka and for these early kind of revolutionary styled ballets. But then in his middle period, which is much lesser known, became neoclassical, very sweet tunes in kind of pseudo-Baroque classical styles. And then again in his late period, joins the sort of 12 toners in his own special way. But we can't put our finger exactly on Stravinsky as a singular plinth, rather a constantly evolving artist. And it seems there are multiple creatives who fit in one or the other category to some extent. So I suppose to kick off, I might ask, do you think this categorization makes sense? Do you see that artists do seem to fit one or the other category?
I think that categorization does make sense, but I see it as a function of personality more than anything else. So there are people who by temperament are extraordinarily open-minded, open to new experiences, let's say. And in order to maintain a thriving artistic production, they need the continuous pressure point of constant outbranchings and new discoveries. And if there isn't sufficient pressure coming from that, they become bored, right? Or the work doesn't reveal itself fully to them anymore. So I think that's fundamentally a question of personality, right? There are others who, to paraphrase an artist, I don't remember which one, are happy to tend their own garden, right? Indefinitely, and just occupy themselves with this tiny plot of land and progressively refine it and deepen their understanding of it. So to be absolutely clear, there's no sense whatsoever that one is preferable to the other, right? But it's a question of, are you protean? Do you constantly need to try new things and expand the range of what you do? Or are you more inclined to delimit a very specific range of action and then try to deepen that over the course of a lifetime? So I myself have taken maybe a while to understand that in my case it's definitely a protean approach. It's not that I want it to be that way necessarily, but that's how it is. And that's probably gotten me into trouble at various points in my career. But the authentic artist operates out of necessity. That's the only register that matters. And if something spontaneously reveals itself to your perception as being necessary, it's like a beckoning. It's like a hand stretching out from the dark that says, look in this direction as hard as you can, and you have to go.
And in your pursuit, well, I was just saying, in your pursuit of, you found now that you are this sort of more of maybe a poly artist, but was that discovery in pursuit of maybe the singular style? Were you looking, what is my voice? What is the thing that is myself? And it's not this and it's not this, or perhaps it's this. And was it a discovery that is in fact not one thing, or rather that each individual part kind of is part of yourself, but is not complete? Was it, which was it? Was it kind of demystification of, oh, I see, there isn't a single pathway? Or was it in searching for it that you discovered that it's not your mode?
Well, I don't think it is very much about me or about the search for a voice. I don't see things in those terms at all. I think it's more like, you're uncontrollably interested in certain things, and you have to satisfy that curiosity, or else it creates a crushing internal pressure. It's more like that. It is all of a piece, right? Because whatever you happen to formulate and express across different artistic domains always has the same source, because ultimately, despite the number of things that you might be interested in, you're just one limited person, right? And you have hopefully a fairly unified psyche, and it all comes from one source, unless there's something seriously wrong with you. So it can take different forms, and that's partly because you're interested in different media, you're interested in trying things, and there are just so many figures who had that characteristic. One who might not immediately come to mind, but who's kind of interesting in this regard, is the poet Rimbaud. Very, very interesting character, who stopped writing poetry just because he lost interest in it.
Yeah.
And it's not like that wasn't the end of his intellectual life. We know this from the letters, right? He sent all these letters home to his mother, requesting all of these treatises on arcane subjects that he was interested in learning about. Like metallurgy or whatever, like all of these things. And it's like, that's a continuation of the same mental processes that were at work in his poetry. And it's like, you don't control that. There's a nice quote by Marcel Duchamp also, who said, because he was asked throughout his life about how he stopped painting in 1913. And he answered, it's not something that you choose to do. It's like breaking a leg. It's involuntary. It happens to you, right? And you become interested in something else or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Lots of artists who go on to be sort of mono artists tending their own garden do nevertheless often experiment quite widely, quite boisterously in their youth, and only arrive at this style after a period of intense experimentation. Whereas the poly artists seem to exist in a state of permanent youth, almost permanent apprenticeship, permanent becoming. We don't get this sense of final arrival, perhaps, in the same way we get with the mono artists. These extreme stylistic shifts and divergences, which often go deep into middle age, sometimes a tendency so extreme that each individual artwork can seem like the work of a different artist. It all seems like it has a certain youthfulness to it that the mono artists do not. The mono artists are like people who've settled down, who are now living life day to day, and have found their little corner of the world that they're calling home. Whereas the poly artists, there is something of the perpetual student in them. Do you think that your own work with so many students may have affected the way you've gone towards this more protean direction, spending so much of your life as a teacher as well as a composer?
Well, regarding what you're calling mono artists, I think that can be true, but it depends on how closely you're looking at individual works in their production. So, for example, I can think of artists whose style really did not evolve very much over the course of their careers, and they arrive at a kind of a functioning technique that they can iterate, and they can do that successfully, and it happens to dovetail with something audiences are interested in. Then that's kind of a deadly combination, because then you're kind of stuck in a way. Like Messiaen is an example of that. He found his style when he was in his early 20s.
Yeah. And
not just his style, but his whole technical apparatus. And it really doesn't change very much over the intervening decades at all. So there are figures who are like that. But then you can also look at people like, from the domain of painting. I wrote a long piece recently that talked about the informal versus the informal in art. Yeah. And as an example through which to look at that question, I gave Piet Mondrian and Barnett Newman. And Newman, he actually wasn't particularly productive. I have his catalogue raisonné, and there's not very many paintings. There's like he maybe completed 60 paintings or something over the course of his life. Now you could caricature Newman as the painter who just did stripes, right? He did color field paintings, and that's it. And then you've kind of put him away in a little corner. And that's kind of true because the scope of what he did was very limited. But even within that extremely narrow bandwidth, there is an evolution. There's a technical evolution. His preoccupations clearly changed. There's a difference between the late paintings and the early paintings and so on. So it depends on how closely you're looking, because people do evolve in their approach. Otherwise, I would think you would just get so bored if you really just did the same thing for 50 years. I can't imagine that. So as far as my own practice is concerned, I think that it's all of a piece. Once again, I think you can pretty easily tell that my preoccupations are the same regardless of what medium I'm working in, and throughout the years, the form that it takes will be different, of course, and some of the elements, some of the materials will change. But I think of those as not necessarily the most crucial defining characteristics, but things that lie a little closer to the surface.
And I wonder if, because you've spoken before on artistic constraints, which are often elected, or one finds them, books written without a particular letter of the alphabet, for instance, to take a rather extreme example. And if we go back in sort of classical music history, we find often the constraints are formal. Classical music sounds a lot like classical music because it adhered to certain conventions of the day, which were not readily broken. Baroque music, much the same. And I wonder if, especially among the mono artists, there is a sense of the constraint in that perhaps there is a will to do something different, but a belief that one's art is one's brand or one's self, and that within the constraints built. So if you're Yasujiro Ozu and you're making, one of his late films, which will be about a family drama, probably someone leaving home and a clash between old Japan and new Japan. These are the sort of eternal themes. And I wonder if it might become an artistic constraint that is productive to actually remain within your bounds. Understand that Ozu could have made a gangster film or a war film. Maybe he did so in his early career. And his refusal to do so isn't just natural predilection to the subject, but a belief in refining one thing. One can discover in it, as you say, all of these permutations, which are perhaps more difficult for the poly artist to achieve, because the poly artist will simply move to an entirely new form or a new way of thinking about things, a little bit more of a revolutionary artist. So can we envision at least some of these mono artists as, in a way, constraining themselves intentionally for the sake of their art, rather than necessarily they're acting to their natural predilection, which necessarily always ends in the same thing?
Well, it depends entirely on how much pressure you're placing upon your practice, really. Right. So I gave the example of Messiaen, and like there's a pretty hilarious little text written by Morton Feldman about Messiaen, where he's kind of making fun of him, and he says it's like, you get the sense with Messiaen that, this state of affairs expressed in his music is just accepted as being kind of eternal, and it's never going to change. And it's that might be an instance of an artist where they're not really interrogating their process all that much. And the point of this comment is not to impugn Messiaen in any manner, but just to illustrate the point, which is that you can devolve into a kind of academicism, right, where you're perpetuating your own language indefinitely without putting adequate pressure on it. You see that also in the later work of Hindemith. Hindemith, in his early years, was a protean figure. He was a revolutionary, intensely creative, fascinating character. And from the mid-30s onwards, he becomes more and more preoccupied with formalizing his thinking, creating theories, and very much to the detriment of the work. So there are entire cycles of pieces by Hindemith where he's become adept at deploying a certain language, and he can sort of churn these pieces out, and they're of an acceptable level of craft, but there's not much more to them than that very often. So that's something that I personally find difficult to be interested in. But I think if an artist is capable of working within a very limited domain and continuously renewing it, then more power to them as far as I'm concerned, you know. But it's fundamentally a question of pressure.
Could you what exactly do you mean by pressure? What does that actually look like? How does that actually manifest in an artist's day-to-day work?
The photographer William Eggleston likes to say that he's at war with the obvious. That's what I mean by pressure. It's refusing to accept things that merely work, right? Because you want to make sure that there's a possibility of making discoveries, that the world can be made new again every day.
To make the decisions more conscious, maybe, and to have an internal apparatus for avoiding cliche.
Yeah, it's something like, what would you call it? Quotient of liveliness. It's like, we know this with our perceptual apparatus, right? That if something doesn't change, then it turns into a background feature. We no longer pay much attention to it. Just like if you're sitting in a room, you know more or less unconsciously that whatever is behind your head is still there, it still exists, but you pay no mind to it because you're focusing on the screen in front of you or the book or whatever it is you're working on. And the things that don't solicit your active perception stop existing for all intents and purposes. And I think that can be the case with an artistic practice as well. It's like if you've internalized your language to such an extent that it kind of disappears, then you might not be putting enough pressure on it in order to have your perceptions be fully activated.
So it's perceptive activation as sort of the end point, the vanishing point, the event horizon of art. So the world is at its most artistic when it's at its most fully perceived, or rather, the more things are in the foreground, the more they resemble art to us, or an experience that is an artistic one, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's about not defaulting to the skillful deployment of technique.
Yeah.
And it comes to an interesting point, because we're talking very internally about what the artist wills or does not will. But you know, especially as I talk about sort of age-old conventions, there's also the outside will, which is what is expected of an artist, what the fans or the buyers of that artist enjoy, what the people who are paying for this to be made want. And so it becomes, especially when we're working in, say, genre, say you're a filmmaker in the 1940s, you make noir pictures. That's what you make. That's what you're funded to make. You want to do something else, but you know the only thing that's putting the money on the table is if it's, black and white, light coming through slats, someone's been murdered, and no one gets away with it. In the end, that's what you have to work with. So I suppose it's curious the way in which an artist has to fend not only with themselves, but also with the business of art. And I think to maybe Rossini, who I think is maybe one of the most incredible accounts of someone quitting midway through, I think still in his 30s, sort of his operatic career is massive. It's hit after hit. Everyone loves this guy. And he just retires, never writes another opera, reemerges in his old age with these kind of cabinet pieces. He used to do these little piano numbers, which are, interesting or quaint. But that seems to be a revolution, not merely against the self, but against this whole business. I don't want to be an opera guy anymore, and you're not going to pay me to do something that isn't this sort of grand comic opera. So how does the artist, and perhaps you've encountered this with your own following, fend with the fact that they may not want to be what everyone else wants them to be, and they have a brand, they have a look, they have a feel?
It really depends, right? You have to get into some specific cases, because my sense is, on occasion, and it's very, very rare, you see artists emerging in basically total isolation, whose practice is essentially 100% private. Nobody sees the work they're doing. They don't exist in the marketplace. They don't exist professionally at all. Their work is created in a total vacuum, and then maybe it's discovered after they die. That does occasionally happen. There was a famous outsider artist, well, posthumously famous, called Henry Darger, D-A-R-G-E-R.
Vivian Girls. Yeah.
Right, exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. He fits into that category, you know.
Someone like Nan Caro, maybe, or indeed Kafka, Dickinson.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Dickinson's a good example. Vivian Maier, the photographer, is also a good example. She made hundreds of thousands of exposures over the course of her life, worked as a nanny, stored them all in an attic. Nobody ever saw them, and they were discovered totally by accident by a photography historian when she died. And it turns out it's one of the great bodies of work in photography of the 20th century. You know, stuff like that. So that does happen. But I think those cases are vanishingly rare. And most of the time, there's some kind of a dialogue between internal pressures, let's say, and external ones. And where exactly you fall along that spectrum is totally a personal matter. What I think is disingenuous and perhaps not sufficiently discussed is the idea that art music, which presently takes the form of a rather inward-looking and heavily institutionalized world, is somehow not subject to those pressures, right? That there's, on the one hand, there's the commercial world, which is motivated by essentially making a buck and being commercially viable. And then there's the art music world, which is somehow miraculously sheltered from those pressures. In reality, though, the art music world is beholden to all kinds of perverse incentives, which may in fact be even more corrupting than the influence of the marketplace. It's just that we don't admit them as such. So, for example, artistic directors are looking for a certain type of work that fits in with their programming, or that fits in with an ideology, which is even worse. There are all sorts of committees of experts that decide what gets funded and what doesn't get funded, and so on, and that creates pressures on composers in the same sense as purely commercial pressures do. The difference, though, I think, is that commercial pressures can be energizing and galvanizing in a way, because there's a real sense of, what would you say, a real sense of resonance in terms of who's receiving the work. And I think that, a domain like opera, which you mentioned earlier, is an amazing example of that, because opera is just too expensive to completely ignore that question, right? It's an insanely compromise-ridden medium for that reason, right? You have to, an opera has to be successful. It has to engage an audience, or else you won't be able to do another one. So those pressures have resulted in extraordinary works being created. It's altogether too simplistic to consider commercial pressures as being simply negative.
And opera is an interesting realm for this. I mean, I'm only very much on the edge lines of this, but there is a kind of cultural battle against the so-called Reggie theatre and the more populist style of a repertory opera. And it's often repertory. They're bringing out these older works, but sort of giving them a sort of contemporary art music splash of paint. And Jack used to work at the Deutsche Oper, so he often was first-hand experienced a lot of these explosive and violently received takes on ancient and beautiful works. But it's a curious case of these two pressures hitting into each other, because of course the art music establishment is very much involved in sort of contemporary opera production, and the experts and the musicians are coming from that realm, at least partially. But then you do have the audience who are flinging phones at the stage and yelling, and at least in continental Europe. I know the British audiences are very docile, and also aren't served up anything quite so interesting anyway. But I've heard a lot of this, and how is that really resolved, or can that be resolved? We have both pressures at once, and then in the middle somewhere we've got an artist trying to sort of bridge this impossible gap of one form of art music that is sort of gleefully sailing away from the masses because the masses are somewhat tasteless, and yet at the same time they need those masses to, I mean, we say masses, at least the cultural ring that still buys into opera, because of course it was once a lot more popular than it is today. An opera star used to be like a pop star. Now it's sailing away. But even so, there is still a fairly large group of people who maybe don't agree with the art world's definition of opera, but nonetheless are still sort of paying customers. Is the artist in the middle of that really lost in both collisions at once?
I don't think there's a solution to this on the horizon at the moment. I see this as being a very serious existential problem for art music, and I don't know what the answer is. I think that right now, culturally, we don't really have a vehicle for art music that is properly public-facing. I think it doesn't exist. I've listened to a lot of contemporary operas, partly because I sit on various juries, and I like to keep an eye on what's happening as well, and out of just my own curiosity. This is, again, not to criticize composers, because I think this is it's a cultural and a structural problem. But the last time that I heard a totally convincing contemporary opera that felt necessary and felt, like it had the potential to communicate with a large number of people, that's maybe happened once in 20 years. It's vanishingly rare. And if you think about the amount of effort that goes into producing an opera and the expense of it and everything, it's amazing to me that people persist. But then if you were to ask me, well, what is the venue? What is the vehicle for art that is not art music that is not primarily commercial in its orientation? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. What I see is a music world that, again, is very inward facing, has lost its sense of, I don't want to say necessity, because there are lots of great artists who are producing good work, but it seems like there's a communication problem that's kind of catastrophic at this point. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. If you look at the immediate post-war era and what composers were doing then, to one extent you could say, well, it was really an activity that was of interest to a small number of people. They were never in the musical mainstream. And so on and so forth. It's not as though Stockhausen was a household name in 1954. But nevertheless, there's a sense that the composers working at that time were responding authentically to what was a very peculiar and unusual set of historical circumstances, and doing so entirely authentically, as far as I'm concerned, and producing work that holds up today, because it really is the product of a real necessity. One can like it or not like it. That's another question. It's really a matter of taste. But I think it would be hard to deny that the work comes out of a real impulsion that was very strongly felt.
And Stockhausen has not himself. I mean, you very rarely meet someone who could name 3 pieces by Stockhausen, but his influence on other artists that people have heard of and do listen to is considerable as well. Björk cites Stockhausen's major influence. Artists like Aphex Twin, in the pop sphere, people who music lovers might have heard of, and aren't necessarily just interested in art music. In the last 100 years or so, at any rate since modernism, I feel like there's been more and more fetishization of revolutionary art. When an artwork offends its audience or disturbs its audience or marks a huge turning point from the foregoing trajectory of art, we tend to think of it as doing the right thing. The whole way that the rite of spring premiere, for example, has been mythologized is a good example of that. It feels like, yes, it must have been doing the right thing if it caused a riot. And it means that the poly artists, the genre-altering artists, the boundary pusher, at the expense of the great craftsman, the great sort of conservative mono artist, has been the model. And maybe one of the reasons for the great bifurcation between, ivory tower art music and popular music is this fetishization of the new and the strange and the revolutionary, and seeing a system that's more like patronage as better for pushing the art forward. The patron model in the past did produce people like Haydn, people like Wagner, who did mark entire, new schools, new ways of doing music. It could be that's something that's going on.
I have to preface my comments by underlining the fact that I don't see this as being even slightly a political question, although it's often framed that way. The question of whether artists should be subsidized through
small c conservative when I said it, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a political question. I think that you can just look at the way these systems function, look at what they've produced, and compare that to the way other systems have functioned historically, and draw your own conclusions. But I mean, it seems completely obvious to me that a bureaucratized, institutionalized art world in which you're forever filling out absurd forms, I don't see that as being a positive development. I can't see it that way. And the thing about the patronage system, and there's all kinds of objections, some of them reasonable, to that system, but at least there's a sense of, there's a relationship between the artist and the person supporting their work that is real, right? The person who's paying for it knows who the artist is, and they know why they're supporting it, and they have some idea of what they're going to get. And it's not a perfect model, of course, right? But the bureaucratized world is a non-relationship between the artist and the people paying for it, right? Because it's taxpayer money that's being allocated by a quote-unquote committee of experts, that's the term that comes up again and again, who aren't spending their own money, right? And I want to, once again, it's not a political question. Look at it from the point of view of an artist, Do you want to have a total non-relationship with the people who are funding you and have everything be bureaucratized? Do you think that that's, in the long term, let's say, is that the best approach to take? And personally, I don't think it is. So you could have a look at a very interesting book called The Gift by Lewis Hyde. And he talks about the contentious and complicated relationship between the arts and commerce. And he's very insightful about this question. And he talks about the fact that essentially there are three possibilities, right? So either the artist is their own patron, which is to say you have some remunerative activity in your life, and you take some of the money that you earn by being a banker or a plumber or whatever you do, and you give that to yourself in order to fund your own artistic
Wallace
practice.
Stevens, for example. Yeah.
Sure, Charles Ives or whatever. Yeah. There's lots of examples. William Carlos Williams,
yes.
Physician poet, right? Or you can find some external patronage, that is somebody else who likes what you're doing and wants to help you keep on doing it.
The Esterházys, yeah.
Right, exactly. Or Mary Louise Curtis or whatever. There's lots of figures like that. Harriet Shaw Weaver, right? And then the third option is you try to survive in the open marketplace, right? You you commercialize your work, and you try to live from the proceeds. Those are the three options as far as he's concerned. It seems like today and maybe since the post-war era, we've had a kind of quasi-fourth option, which is public funding. But in my view, it's time. It's really time to move away from that, because I think it's humiliating and subjugating to artists, and I think that anything is preferable to that personally. That doesn't mean that I don't think institutions should be funded publicly, like museums and symphonies and things like that. That's a separate question, right? I'm talking about directly funding artists.
Yeah. What do these forms look like that you're filling out? I've not even got these as a concept in my head. What kind of questions do you have to answer when you're submitting a work to some tax-funded?
Well, this is funny. I was emailed something this morning that I did not solicit, but somehow this ended up in my inbox. There's an organization in France called the DRAC, DRAC, that hands out money for artistic projects. And so I was looking at their call for projects for supporting composers, and I put out a post on X this morning about this, because the form was just so hilarious. You can't even believe it. You could not make this up. I mean, first of all, like, reading it was just utterly demoralizing and depressing as you read this unbelievably dead bureaucratic language applied to the arts. It's just incredible. So that's one thing. But some of the paragraphs here, I'll give you an example. Let's see here. Like, there's this whole thicket of requirements and restrictions on what you can do. You don't get paid until the work is finished. You can't apply unless it's at minimum 1 year before the premiere date. You have to have a signed letter from the organization that's presenting the concert, etc., etc. It's one line after another of restrictions. The piece has to be at least 10 minutes long. It has to be for X number of instruments, and so on and so forth. Can you imagine, Webern having to like any
10 minutes,
any
10
real
minutes?
artist, any real artist who's not a total sued, trying to make sense of this crap. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, the cave paintings guys.
They would have been out a lot. They would have been out a lot. Definitely.
It makes you long for like old school Hollywood producers or aristocrats, because at least you can kind of play to their kind of madness.
Tastes. It's a human being. Yeah, Esterhazy's a music nerd. Like Ludwig of Bavaria is a music nerd.
Sure. But let me read you this is the coup de grace, okay? This is the really hilarious thing. So there's, under the eligibility criteria in this form, it says it has to be a musical work, an original musical work, that it consists of a work of the spirit or of the mind, une œuvre de l'esprit. And then it says in brackets, see article L1112-2 CPI. It's like
a work of the spirit defined. That's a sublime definition, perhaps. We can't rule it out.
A work of the spirit, see article L112. It's like,
Did you look it up? Did you look up the article?
No, I'm not quite that bored. But I mean, it's like, I see this stuff all the time, and I just shake my head at it, and I'm like, why do people accept this, and why do they think that this is humiliating? It's humiliating for an artist. So I don't apply for stuff like that ever.
Yeah, there's a story about Brian Eno receiving one of these letters, and he was about to throw it out when he saw one of the conditions was the piece must be 1.5 seconds long. He thought, oh, okay, that's interesting, and saw it was from Microsoft. And that's the reason Brian Eno did all the Windows 98 little music snippets.
Yeah.
I was reminded when Milo brought up the old Hollywood producers of I can't remember who it was. I think it was someone at Paramount approached Schoenberg when he was living in Hollywood, and and this producer really loved Verklärte Nacht, and would really loved the idea of Schoenberg writing something similar for his movie, and approached him about it. And Schoenberg was, I think, when he first arrived in the States, having some trouble with money, and really strongly was umming and ahhing, considering whether he would do it, but eventually decided against it and wrote a letter back to the producer from Paramount that just said on it, "Not one step backwards." That his protean instincts were so extreme that he wouldn't even make a move back in the direction of that post-Wagnerian Straussian language he came from.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, that would be death. That would be certain death. You can't move backwards if you're an artist. There are those who parody themselves, or who put on a mask and play a role. I think that it would have to be really, really tough to be a pop musician and peak early and have a huge amount of public success when you're 22, and then have to repeat that for the rest of your life. Everybody wants to hear the one song that was number one hit, and you just have to do that for decades. I think that would be a very particular kind of hell.
Yeah, there's some sort of Dante punishment to Mick Jagger's fate at the moment, still singing these songs from his mid-20s, expressing things that presumably he's ceased to feel quite a long time ago in a musical language that maybe he doesn't really feel in his body in the same way that he did in youth. Yeah, I think about them all a lot, because now I'm the age when pop musicians start to just sort of spectacularly become talentless and uninteresting in sort of the start of their 30s, and I write a lot of songs in kind of a pop idiom, and it's there's an interest, but I'm in this sort of interesting position where I've not had any modicum of like personal success with it. I've had songs that other people have done, but it's but I feel like now it's quite nice. I feel like I've come out well from a Faustian pact in a way. That I'm forgo any youthful success, and certain opportunities, certain abilities to tell the truth open up to you that are impossible when you're exposed to that level of fame and success and positive feedback loops, the way loads of these rock and pop stars are. Yeah.
I think the ideal scenario is one in which you have enough success to sustain you, but it's not so much that you're locked into performing a personality over and over again forever. There's a guy who's pretty well known in the podcast circuit called Seth Godin, who's a marketing expert, and he's written quite a lot about this. He talks about the concept of the minimum viable audience. And this is something that nobody really thinks about when they get into the arts, but a lot of people have all these fantasies about what it means to make it as an artist, and they imagine that it's selling out Madison Square Gardens, or it's whatever, it's selling 100,000 or 1 million copies of an album, or something like that. And his point is that's not the thing you should aspire to, right? That's not going to sustain you. What sustains you is having the minimum viable audience so that you can keep doing it. And that number is going to be different for everybody. If you're a poet, that might mean that you have 50 readers.
Yeah.
50 readers might be enough to sustain a poetic practice so that you don't feel completely isolated. You've got some people reading you, you're getting some feedback, and you can put out a chapbook and enough people will buy it so that you can keep doing it. Or it might be 500 people, or it might be 5,000. It depends on the medium, depends on, what your personal circumstances are. But put a number to it. It's like, if you're putting out an album, how many people need to buy it so that you can do another album? It's like, just think about that and put a number on it. And that's the thing that really matters. And so before you start thinking about, selling out this or that stadium, it's like, well, how about getting to 500 real listeners? 500 real listeners who would actually buy a CD or whatever it is, or a download. Because that's hard. It's very hard to go from 0 to 500. And that's the step that a lot of people skip.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the people who write these forms, especially with relevance to very practical thinking there. I wonder what the mindset is. Is there someone who is writing these forms believing that they have identified the kind of recipe for sublime art? And you just have to fulfill these characteristics here, and a great piece of work will emerge that otherwise wouldn't have, because they'd be, it wouldn't be a work of the spirit, according to such and such article, and therefore it's not a great work. And I wonder if there is perhaps a form that could be written that would guarantee a great work. They just haven't written it yet. But the other artwork is the form, formulating the form, and we've got to figure that bit out.
Yeah, that's the tricky bit, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, the thing that this bureaucratized art world completely ignores is the fact that you can. It tends to lead to a very insular art world that is completely disconnected from any external reality or any external pressures. And you can hear this chorus of voices saying, yeah, but that's the point. We want to be sheltered from commercial pressures, right? So we can do the work the way we want to without having it be perverted by the need to sell. And it's like, fair enough to some extent. There are some forms of art that are not commercial and will never succeed in that sense. And it doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist, right? But that I don't feel that that's the solution, though. And if what emerges out of it is warehouses full of unsold books, which is the case in my native Canada, where the Canada Council for the Arts has all these stipulations about what constitutes a book publication. And it's like it has to be at least 64 pages, you have to print at least 500 copies, et cetera, et cetera. Then you end up with warehouses full of books that eventually get pulped.
Yeah. I suppose...
It's an interesting apocalypse, just the idea of producing all of this, not necessarily unworthy artwork, but there are sort of a legislation to tell you must produce 500 books of this extremely niche subject or matter, and they will be destroyed, but you must nonetheless produce them. And it's such a bizarre, compared to early art and how art was conceived of, these rare objects, artifacts, individually crafted. We now feel obliged to mass produce art for no one, or for maybe, five committee members, and then it's destroyed, but at least it was made. And it's no longer the point is to make something immortal. I mean, you say in 20 years, you maybe had one experience of an opera that felt important, but that's no longer the point of it. Is just to keep it going. There is opera, there has been opera, there shall always be opera. And we've created an ingenious system of paperwork to ensure infinite opera forever, regardless. And in fact, quite despite people who like opera or go to see it, they're not part of the equation. We've happily cut them out of proceedings to produce the infinite opera machine, just on its own terms.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like what's happening with AI now, like with the social media platforms being completely infested by bots. It's pretty funny. Like, I went on to YouTube the other day, and there was a comment that had been left on my channel that you could tell in 2 seconds was written by AI, and it was like a kind of an anonymous account. You're like, well, this is probably, there's probably not a human being behind this. And then below the comment field, there's the option to reply. And now YouTube has this feature where it has an AI that will suggest a comment for you. So it's like the comment wasn't written by a human, and then you can just click a button and an AI response will be automatically generated. It's perfect. It's like a totally closed artificial loop that exists only to increase the amount of quote unquote engagement on a video. And it's like,
I love the notion that we can have fully automated social media. All the posts from all the users are automated. They upload generated images and then they all comment on them. They have fights in the comments, but fully automated. So then, humanity can do other better things, knowing that it's, they don't need to worry. The comments are being liked, disliked. It's all happening. We've managed to outsource the whole affair. We can put the phone down, secure in the fact that engagement is really being engaged with. And we can just build a pyramid or something. Well, so I think we should push forward with this.
Maybe we've gone full circle. It's like we've discovered that social media is actually kind of unpleasant, and maybe we can just outsource it to bots and have it do its thing, and we can go off and make paintings and write symphonies.
Yeah, and all music that is easily sort of fit into a cliche form, that the mono art in the kind of worst sense of that word, where it is reducible to a set of surface level textures and sort of stylistic gestures. That's the stuff that AI does really well. AI does like bad hip hop beats extraordinarily well, and now no one has to ever do a boring hip hop beat ever again. No human being ever has to fit those. In a way, it's strange that AI isn't causing like this sudden burst of avant-garde energy. It's strange that it doesn't seem to be having that effect yet. Maybe we're too early into it to really see that, but that's sort of my first instinct. Like, okay, the machine does this specific kind of thing that's a cliche, that's easily nameable, reproducible. It does that really well. Now I have to find something else to do. Something that it doesn't understand as a prompt. And you can try it with I'm sure you've also played a bit with sort of music AIs, and there are just certain things that it doesn't even begin to engage with. If you say, give me a Renaissance polyphonic piece, but with Stravinskyan rhythmic sort of ideas, either it will sound completely like Stravinsky, or it will sound completely like Renaissance polyphony. It can only pastiche the one style or the other. It can't do these sort of human things. It can't do the human melding, merging that is behind so much of our own creativity.
Well, it struggles with the unprecedented is the thing with it. And a lot of what we enjoy is precedented. I like many precedented forms, perhaps most of them trees, very precedented, paintings of trees. Precedents abound, but they're good. But it is true that it can only replicate what has been before, often very well, which is disconcerting. But yeah, it should be the trigger of the adventure of find what has not been before, what lacks precedent. And I suppose the risk of that is going even further up the ivory tower to the most abstract things you can conceive of, which are only even remotely interesting because they're unusual. And this is, some people accuse even 20th century music of doing this.
People accuse Stockhausen of this, yeah.
Exactly, trying to be original, not bothering whether it sounds nice or good or appealing or whether it has any kind of spiritual matter, but more that it's just formally out there. But I always think the formal adventure can peel round, and there's some meaning to it. There's a purpose, even if the purpose is, escaping the machine, abandoning the machine.
Well, what AI is good at doing, of course, is modeling things that already exist and doing that at speed and with a kind of incredible virtuosity that exceeds what a human can do. And what that reveals is not so much, look at this extraordinary artwork that was just generated by AI. I don't think that's the correct framework to look at this. I think what it's revealing is, look at, there's a lot of human production that we classify as creative that isn't creative. In fact, not even slightly, is anti-creative, right? Because what it's doing is permutating things that already exist and putting a very slight twist of novelty onto them, and that's basically it. And there's a lot of stuff that's like that. Now, that's not to say that what's valuable in art is the thing that is the most unprecedented or the thing that's the most shocking or whatever, because I don't think that's the case at all. Take something like, Louis Armstrong at the end of his life has a #1 hit in the UK with What a Wonderful World. He's 70 years old at that point, or 69, or however old he was. And there's nothing in that recording that's totally unprecedented. It's not a revolutionary recording. He didn't innovate some entirely new approach to singing in that piece. We've heard it before, right? But that song is a necessary song, and I don't think anybody else could have made it unless they'd had his decades of experience. right? So there's no formal innovation in it, but what an amazing thing, to have done. And it's like AI can't do that, obviously, because it's a matter of embodied lived experience. So, but what it can do is it can decimate areas of human cultural activity that are disguised as creative and really are not, right? So there are entire genres that are like this, and yeah, those people are going to be out of work. What can you do?
Yeah. in the uncontroversial field, you could say something like copywriting, not the worthiest of genres, but certainly almost immediately obliterated. I think any remaining copywriters are just there for the tradition, to keep hold of those pillars.
For the love of the craft.
My friend Kenny Goldsmith, who's a really interesting poet, has been saying this for decades, that copyright is a totally absurd notion in the age of the internet. In fact, it became absurd already in the age of the photocopier, which was decades ago, right? And the internet just accelerated that. And it's like, yeah, you can kind of apply copyright law in edge cases, like a 2-second sample of a song being reused in a hip hop track and stuff like that. But it's increasingly hard. And there are all kinds of highly publicized cases of plagiarism coming out in the music world, where people are bringing out suits against composers who have unconsciously lifted half a bar of a song or something. It's like it's not possible.
Or such intangible things as groove. It took the groove of "Let's Get It On."
Right. Yeah, exactly. So
I wonder if, something we said before. It made me wonder whether mono artists only seem mono to us when we're remote from their cultural context. So something like ancient Chinese poetry all seems like it's by one poet. Okay, I'm reading it in English, but it's all like I don't know the fine distinctions yet between like Li Po and Tu Fu and Wang Wei. It all seems very, very similar concerns expressed in a very similar way. Whereas if you're in China in like 800 AD, it couldn't be anything more different. What do you mean? Wang Wei and Tu Fu, they're completely different artists. And I'm sure, we've been in the kind of situation in life where you're listening to Mozart in your room and someone comes in and goes, "Is that Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf?" And you go, no, it's one of Dittersdorf's contemporaries, and yeah, maybe that's going on. Maybe it's just a subjectivity thing. This whole question of art that's iterative and art that's algorithmic and art that's more humane, protean, evolving.
yeah, well, sometimes it's appropriate and necessary to produce very large amounts of work, and if you're doing that, it's not possible to reinvent the wheel every time you sit down to make something. And that's legitimate. There are reasons for that. Like if you're in a situation where you need to produce a new cantata every week, for example, in the 1720s, for example, then it's like you might find that you have to rely upon certain conventions in order to do that. It's not possible otherwise. But nevertheless, the work fulfills a need. It's like, well, we need a cycle of cantatas for the liturgical year. Or imagine if you're a newspaper strip cartoonist and you have to produce a strip every day for 50 years. It's like, that's a job, and there's a role that you're fulfilling, and not every single one of them is going to be amazing, but you have to produce the work. So I'm sympathetic to people who are in that situation, and they're fulfilling a need. It might mean that when seen from afar, it looks like this monolithic block of not very differentiated works, right? But that might just be a matter of perspective.
Yeah. We get a curious case in terms of actors and acting in this particular discussion, because you get, I think, the actors most renowned and most beloved, at least today, I think this was very different previously, are the sort of chameleons who can do anything. You don't recognize them oh, that was him. I didn't realize, because it's such a sort of contorting performance that they've changed their voice, their look. They've lived for years as a kind of like cobbler in order to become the cobbler. And then, 5 years later, you see them, they're Iron Man. It's wow. Whereas you have the other kind of actor who is always himself. You get, your Bill
Ford,
Murray,
yeah.
Harrison Ford. You can list them character actor types. They show up. It doesn't even seem like they're acting. They're often leveled at accusations of, they don't do any, they don't prepare. They just pick out the script, read it. But we like them anyway, but they're not good actors, or they're inferior actors, which feels, it has the same kind of, prejudices built in. The notion that being able to be anything and having that flexibility and that ingenuity is superior to being very beautifully what you are consistently. Sometimes you need Bill Murray for the film. You don't want someone to pretend beautifully to be Bill Murray. It's better to get the thing itself that can only be that and nothing else, but really funnel that thing all the way. And it's maybe it's a sort of a crossover of what is art and what is the craft of an artisan, in that we really appreciate and we're amazed in the kind of maybe lower section of the mind at just what's happening before our eyes. How are they doing that? How did you paint that? It looks like a real guy. This really basic, like, my God, you're good at that trick that you do, versus what might be the more artistic viewpoint, where it's like, it's wonderful if you can juggle on a unicycle while doing sort of skips. That's great. However, the work does not demand that. The work demands a guy who looks just like this, with that face and that tone of voice. And I wonder if is this kind of prejudice, does it leak into the other forms too? Are we just too impressed with the kind of a poly-minded genius to see past that and understand it isn't necessary?
Well, some of us want to be gainfully employed, and we want to do something that is valuable to others, and maybe makes their lives a bit better or more interesting, or and I think that's probably the case for a lot of artists. We don't want to work in a total vacuum and just put the work in a drawer somewhere and hope that somebody discovers it someday when we're dead. You want it to be out in the world, and there's some amount of negotiation. It's a dance, right, between inner necessity and the vicissitudes of the outer world, and nobody's immune to that, right? So you have to always take that into account if you're tempted to criticize an artist for maybe overproducing in one direction or something. It's like, well, maybe they needed to do that because they needed to make a living, or maybe there were people that wanted it at that time, and maybe the culture has moved on since then, and we only need one or two representative works of that genre, and the rest are going to fall away. That's fine too. How many works did Telemann complete? 6,000, maybe.
He's
He's said to be the most productive, most prolific composer in history. And there's this kind of prejudice against figures like that. He gets criticized as having, mass-produced this minimally interesting work, and he's often unfairly compared to his exact contemporary, who's Bach, of course, and that's totally unfair. He was a virtuoso and very imaginative, and wrote great works in every genre, and there's lots and lots of them, and there isn't time to listen to all of them, but that's how it goes.
Yeah, and a similar sort of thing happens with Telemann to the Karl Dittersdorf example from before. People often come in where you're listening to Telemann and ask if it's Bach, because they hear, I don't know, a harpsichord continuo or something, and they name the one Baroque composer who has permeated into popular culture. Yeah, lots of artists seem to be more or less unique to us, more or less worth our attention based on things more or less entirely outside of their control, just really large cultural forces. Yeah, the same is kind of true of the other Baroque people as well, even ones who are more popular once you get outside their greatest hits. Someone like Handel or Rameau. Well,
Pachelbel is a particularly tragic example of that, I would say, because he wrote an amazing collection of organ pieces called Hexachordum Apollinus that nobody knows. It's a wonderful work. It's 6 arias, each of which has 6 variations. in that kind of Southern German austere style of the 17th century, right? Where it's a very purified style, very simple in some respects, but exquisitely elegant, beautifully written pieces. And I go, everybody just knows that stupid canon, It's like that's kind of that's too bad. But what can you do?
Do you have a least favorite major composer, Samuel?
No, because the people whose work doesn't resonate with me just it falls off the radar. I don't think about it, and I don't actively sit there and write up lists of, oh, I really hate this guy, and oh, this guy, what a number. It's like it's not like that. And also,
But you don't have any like completely heretical anti-Chopin opinions or anything like that.
Nothing quite that entertaining. Part of the reason for that also is I'm old enough at this point to recognize that your tastes can shift, right? You can spend 20 years in total incapacity to find a single interesting thing about a composer, and then suddenly you hear something and you go, that's quite striking. That can happen. So I try to delay judgment as long as possible, or if possible, not even make the judgment in the first place, and just listen to the things that strike me as being compelling and interesting in the moment. There are major figures with whose work I haven't engaged all that deeply for whatever reason. Wagner is an example. He's kind of not a blind spot for me exactly, but there are reasons, circumstantial and psychological reasons, where I'm just not maybe able to summon the necessary focus and the attention to listen to extremely long operas or to attend them. It's partly a life thing, a lifestyle thing.
Yeah.
Just having young kids, you can't go out to the opera, and you don't want to listen to a 4.5 hour long opera on a CD. It's just not, So there are things like that.
And the sort of counterpoint question: are there any of the sort of canonical composers who you feel like almost eerily connected to? Maybe you have a sort of an anxiety of influence going on with one of your sort of forebears.
Yeah, of course. The number one for me is Bach, who's been absolutely central to my musical life since I was a child, and that has no signs of changing. The more I listen to that work and play it and study it and become more familiar with the body of work as a whole, the more astounded I am by it, by its inexhaustibility. And also the simple fact that I never tire of it. Like that's fascinating to me. So he's really at the center, and he's profoundly conditioned my own approach to art music and my own understanding of the Western art music tradition. So absolutely, there are other figures too as well that are extremely important. Webern is one. Webern. His work struck me with the force of 1,000 lightning storms when I was 18 years old. I couldn't believe it. I was just knocked out of my chair when I first heard the Opus 5 string quartet. I thought, this is amazing. The 6 pieces, Opus 6, the late cantatas, these things were just absolute revelations, and they continue to be. There are artworks that have the quality of inexhaustibility, where they always seem able to say something new to you, and they continue to be compelling. They can't be, you can't get to the bottom of them. Webern and Bach, certainly. They might seem like an odd pairing, but I think what they both had was, I was asked a while ago, what makes something great? And there's a certain category of person that thinks that art has to be beautiful or pretty or pleasing in some way, and I think that the things that are done with love and that are done with consummate care, I think that always shows. When the notes really matter, when the decisions are really consequential, and you really sweat over them. You can tell. You see that very much in a composer like Kurtag, for example, very clearly. So those sorts of qualities just, you don't even have to seek them out. They just knock you over, and it's like, you're just stunned, and you can't look away.
Do you think Bach is more of a poly artist, to use our category, than we maybe give him credit for? Because he seemed, to his contemporaries at any rate, like an arch conservative, like someone who didn't really leave music somewhere different to the music that he picked up. Do you think Bach did evolve considerably over his career?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there's no question. You can compare the early cantatas that he wrote in Mühlhausen with the ones he wrote in Leipzig, and they're extremely different. You can compare the St. Matthew Passion with the B minor Mass. They're also extraordinarily different in many respects. What's interesting in the case of Bach is that for the last 10 years or so of his life, his productivity just nosedives, right? In the 1720s, and throughout a good part of the 1730s, he's composing like an absolute madman. He's just writing insane quantities of work. And in the last 10 years, the decade of the 1740s, he writes maybe, 5 pieces in 10 years, something like that. But they're works like The Art of Fugue, Musical Offering, the B minor Mass. They're works of unfathomable depth. And that happened, partly because he was finally delivered from a lot of his obligations in Leipzig, and essentially, he was an established figure by that point and could do what he wanted, and he didn't have to produce liturgical music. He didn't have to produce pedagogical works and things like that, and he had a lighter teaching load, and he could sit down and do the things he wanted to do. And what's fascinating is he got into these sort of encyclopedic monolithic projects, the Goldberg Variations and Art of Fugue, where he's trying to exhaust the potential of a given genre or a given form. And you don't see that in the earlier works to the same extent. Well, you see the encyclopedic quality certainly with things like the Well-Tempered Clavier, but no, there is an evolution, and what you also see is it doesn't matter what he's doing, right? He can be writing one of the two-part inventions, or he can be writing a massive choral fantasy like the opening of the St. Matthew Passion. And no matter what the medium is or what the scale is, he's pushing as hard as he can against the edges of what you can do. Always, right? There are all kinds of strange features in the two-part inventions that, like, these are pieces written for beginner piano students, right? There's no reason to make them anywhere near as interesting as he made them, but he did, and that's one of the hallmarks, I think, of a great artist, is you're constantly interrogating, constantly pushing, seeing what the material can do, pushing it almost to the breaking point, and then stepping back a little bit, and you see that throughout his life, really.
And we come into an interesting territory, what some people tend to call the sort of late style, which afflicts or refers to many artists who in their later years, for various reasons, and I think the one you imply here is a good one, that an established figure can finally stop the churn work and actually just do exactly what they wanted to do. But we have people like César Franck, we have Janacek. An interesting case is Liszt, kind of brought on by falling down the stairs, but comes out of that fall a completely different artist. In the case of Liszt, the man who previously liked to put as many notes as possible into any given piece, suddenly starts making these bizarre minimalist sort of,
Via Crucis is an incredible work.
Precisely, and we get Janacek, who prior to his late years is barely a relevant composer. We don't listen to his early stuff; they're still unperformed. Janacek works that people still aren't really that interested in, despite the name. And then César Franck, his final years, he becomes a great composer when previously, again, not someone of any real note, but then he knocks out kind of 3 consecutive masterworks. And I wonder if we can characterize the late style as a thing of almost self-liberation. You're coming to the end of your rope and you're aware. You no longer have to think entirely commercially. Maybe if you had patrons, you've been wise and you have some stocks, and you can think, okay, I'm fine. I'm not going to go broke, and I only have to last 10 years. I have children and they're standing on their own feet. or is it even just a spiritual thing of really, approaching the next phase of the universe? I ought to put something out which is in the kind of culmination of all this stuff, which is compromise. It's me with something else. And Rossini, maybe his sort of little salon pieces felt to him more kind of Rossini soul than all of those comic operas he wrote. But do you have any sort of perspectives on the late style as a thing that seems to emerge across multiple composers and indeed across multiple forms of art?
Well, there are certain pressures that just fall away when you reach a certain point in your life, professional pressures, or the internal pressure to master a language or to see what you can do, or to perform relative to what your colleagues are doing or whatever it might be. And those things just kind of vanish. And what I've noticed in a lot of the late production of certain major artists is a spirit of play, just pure play that comes into it that is extraordinary, because they've got the playfulness, but they've also got the decades of experience and the mastery, and those two things come together. You see that in the late production of Beethoven. Obviously, that's an easy example. But you also see it in Elliott Carter, and that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because Elliott Carter lived to be 102 or 103, I can't remember. So that's a privilege that not many composers can count on, obviously. But I'm not hugely enthusiastic about the monumental works that Carter was writing in the 60s, the double concerto, the third and fourth string quartets, the piano concerto, pieces like that. I find them overly labored, overly kind of complicated in a way that I think obscures rather than amplifies the things that are really distinctive about him as an artist. He probably had to go through that and produce all of those thousands and thousands of pages of sketches and technical exercises in order to get to where he wanted to go. But in his later years, and by later I mean like the 2 decades between when his 80s and when he ultimately died, there's this extraordinary freedom. And he talks about this in the program note to his late work, Sinfonia, which is a massive orchestral piece he wrote in his 90s. And he likens it to a soap bubble that's floating above a city. And it's, you can try to imagine things from the perspective of this soap bubble. And it's like, that's very much the experience I have of listening to his late works, where you can tell that at this point he's internalized all that stuff. He can just write quickly, freely, competently, but with a sense of incredible playfulness. And I was talking about this very question with my friend Betsy Jolas, who's going to be turning 100 this year. Betsy Jolas has had the most incredible life. When she was a child, she knew James Joyce, and her parents were the publishers of Transition, right? And she knew all these major figures of the 20th century, and she's had a very long and very distinguished career as a composer, teacher at the Paris Conservatory, and produced an extraordinarily long list of important works, and she's a great figure. And she said to me, when you get to my age, you're concerned with the question of what can I do that I haven't done already, and what could I do that would be fun to do also. And you come up with these things that it's like, well, I'll try this now because I've already written 300 pieces, so I've never tried this. Mm-hmm. And I think that must be an amazing place to get to. So,
how would you distinguish, Samuel, the difference between the overly labored quality that you don't like in sort of monumental Elliott Carter and the extreme care of the works you love by Webern and by Bach? They seem to meld into each other a little bit. One person's overly labored might be another person's extreme loving care.
Yeah, I'm not sure how labored those Webern pieces are actually in reality, because I've looked really closely at the sketches, particularly for his mid-period vocal pieces. What's very interesting, there's a whole book-length study of that repertoire written by Anne Schreffler, I believe, when she was at Yale University. And what she points out is that when Webern's working on one of these vocal pieces, or indeed, his instrumental miniatures that preceded them, what you see is that he starts writing, and he either can basically complete the piece in one sitting, or the sketch abruptly breaks off and he abandons it. right? So there are lots of fragments. There are hundreds of fragments of Webern pieces that, for one reason or another, the idea doesn't crystallize, and he can't complete the piece, and he abandons it after a few bars, right? But the songs that he did complete seem to have been written, it appears, relatively quickly. And as for the very lengthy genesis of a lot of the later 12-tone pieces, I think that that's partly explained by the fact that he was swamped with with professional obligations because he couldn't make a living. It was very hard for him. So he had to do all kinds of arrangements for Universal Edition. He had to conduct amateur orchestras and all this. He had unbelievable constraints in terms of his professional life. And also by the fact that his personal circumstances were beyond horrific, especially in the last 10 years of his life. And he lost his son, and his music was oppressed by the Nazi Party, and so on and so forth. So he was, he really had an extraordinary amount of hardship and constraints that he was working under. So if you look at things like the Opus 24. Concerto for 9 instruments, and you observe that he spent 18 months writing this 6-minute piece. Yeah, but look at that in the context of what his life was like, and it's not that he was necessarily spending 3 months on 2 bars of music. It's that his work was constantly being interrupted.
Do you think most really great art is relatively easy to do, or at any rate it feels relatively natural? You're not necessarily straining yourself to do it?
The real work happens prior to the writing. That's my sense. So in the case of Carter, maybe writing a piece in an afternoon. Well, yeah, but he had he might have had 95 years prior to that to work out his technique. We don't think about that enough. We imagine that it has to involve hundreds of hours of labor to make a piece. But there are, seriously, how long do you think it would take Picasso to execute one of his paintings? Once the idea was crystallized and once he knew what he was going to do, I'm sure the actual execution of the canvas was relatively swift. But you need 3-4 decades to get to that point, right? So my sense, and what I've striven for in my own creative production, is to not allow the workroom to be the locus of working out what you're going to do. That should all be done beforehand, so that when you do sit down to write, it's to borrow the somewhat metaphysical romantic conception. It's like you're taking dictation, because the art is already formed in a sense. There's an anecdote. I'm trying to remember where I read this. It's completely jumbled up in my mind, but an anecdote about an artist who's commissioned to make a painting of some frogs, and he's being commissioned by a king or a prince or something. He says, "Sure, okay, but I need 5 years, and I need a palace, and I need a staff of 20 people to wait on me." And the prince says, "Okay, sure." And then 5 years pass, and then the artist goes to the king, and the king says, "So, well, let me see the painting or the drawing." And he says, "I need another 5 years." And so he goes back to his palace and his servants, and then finally the artist is a very old man. He's been living in these conditions for however many years, and with one gesture he makes an absolutely sublime painting in like 3 seconds. And I think that's what we're all striving for.
Yeah, I bet the prince felt ripped off.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure. I have to stop because I have a time constraint. But
yeah, no worries. The feeling's mutual. It was great talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.